My name is Margaret Lane. I'm 62 years old, and the day my mother leaned toward me in a silent courthouse and hissed that the woman across the aisle had never served a single day in her life, that she had stolen our family's name and built her glory on a lie, I didn't flinch. I just kept my eyes locked on the judge, because I knew that if I looked away for even a second, I might miss the moment when the truth would finally step into the light and burn away everything she had so carefully constructed. And as the woman stood slowly, her hands brushing against the fabric of her robe, I felt the air shift in a way you only notice when something you've been waiting for your whole life is about to happen. I grew up in a home that didn't need expensive furniture or shining floors to feel rich, because its walls held generations of quiet strength and the kind of honor you don't buy, you earn. And our family name, Lane, wasn't about privilege. It was about trust, about showing up when you said you would, about wearing only what you had earned through real work and real sacrifice. My mother had taught me that from the time I could walk, so when a stranger appeared in our lives claiming a connection so close, she began to use our name, slipping it into conversations and letting people assume she belonged to us. I felt an unease I couldn't quite name. She came dressed in perfectly pressed jackets, speaking in careful, emotional tones that pulled people in, hinting at years of military service, sacrifice, and loss, but always just vague enough to avoid being checked against facts, and the town welcomed her like a long-lost hero, returning home. The first time I saw her up close, it was at a community dinner, and she was already surrounded. People were leaning in, hanging on her every word, smiling in that proud, almost protective way folks do when they think they've found someone worth honoring. She had medals pinned in neat rows, her posture precise, her smile modest but calculated, and yet something felt wrong, too polished, too deliberate. My mother, a retired military nurse who had lived through long deployments and seen real uniforms worn thin with service, sat quietly at the end of the table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the small colored ribbons on the woman's chest. I could see her studying them, not with admiration, but with a silent kind of scrutiny, and I knew from her stillness that something in the display didn't match reality. Over the next few weeks, the woman's presence in town grew like ivy. She appeared at charity events, spoke at school assemblies, posed for photographs with veterans and community leaders, and each time, her story seemed to shift just slightly. Dates bent, details blurred, locations changed. People were so eager to celebrate her that they didn't notice the inconsistencies, or they didn't care. Our family name began appearing under her photos in the local paper, as though it had always belonged to her. Calls started coming from old friends, distant cousins, even neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, all asking if it was true we had a new family member who had been through so much and was finally ready to share her story. I wanted to believe the good version, because it was easier, because the town had been hungry for a hero for a long time, and she had stepped into that role so neatly it felt almost rehearsed. But then came the fundraiser, the one with paper lanterns strung across the square, and the smell of barbecue in the air. And she arrived in full uniform. The crowd leaned toward her as if drawn by some invisible force, their applause warm and unhesitating. Across the lawn, I found my mother, standing still, her eyes locked once again on the ribbons. This time, I saw the exact second her expression changed, confusion tightening into certainty. She reached for my hand and whispered that the sequence was wrong, that the wear on the jacket didn't match a life lived in service, and that we were about to face a choice: stay quiet and let the lie grow, or dig for the truth no matter how unpopular it made us. We started small, asking questions, checking dates and records, looking for photographs or letters that could confirm even one chapter of her supposed service. What we found instead was a trail of vague answers, certificates that looked almost right but not quite, timelines that demanded more days than the calendar offered. My mother reminded me that real honor doesn't fear verification, and with each evening we spent at the kitchen table sorting through what little we'd found, my resolve hardened. But in a town where people love a good story more than they love a hard truth, our quiet investigation was quickly painted as bitterness, jealousy, even spite. Still, we pressed on. At the county records office, we discovered that files connected to her supposed service had been requested and never returned by someone sharing her last known address. That was when I knew we were not just dealing with an embellishment. This was something deliberate, calculated. Then, in the dusty corner of my late uncle's garage, I found it. A small wooden box tucked behind old fishing gear, filled with letters, photographs, and a neatly folded list of names and dates in his handwriting, ending with a note that read simply, "For Margaret." Those letters told the truth my mother had suspected all along. The woman's name appeared nowhere in real military records, and the uniform she wore had been stitched for someone else's life. From that moment, the path forward was clear. We gathered our evidence, locked away copies in separate places, and prepared to take her to court. She responded with a legal claim of her own, demanding a share of family property and funds, insisting she had been promised both as part of her connection to us. The stakes had shifted from honor to money, and the town now had more reason than ever to keep believing her. But my mother, calm and steady as ever, told me the truth was worth the fight, and that when the day came, she would know exactly how to show it. On the morning of the hearing, the air outside was pale and heavy, and as we walked into the courthouse, I carried the box of letters like something alive. We took our seats, the judge watching us with that quiet, measured attention of someone who has heard too many lies to be easily swayed by words alone. Across the aisle, the woman adjusted her robe, offering the cameras her best angle. The lawyers spoke, the arguments unfolded, and then I felt it, that shift in the air, the moment you sense something irreversible is about to happen. My mother's breath was steady beside me, her hand resting lightly on the table, and I knew she was waiting for the exact right second to stand, to move, to end this. And when she finally did, the room would never be the same. As the hearing began, I could feel the invisible weight of every eye in the room pressing against my back, the way a room can seem smaller when the people inside have already chosen who they want to believe. And in this case, it was clear that most had arrived with their minds made up long before the judge ever called the case. The woman across the aisle had crafted an image so complete that even now, even as we were prepared to dismantle it piece by piece, she wore it like second skin, her posture straight, her expression a careful balance of humility and quiet pride. I understood why they wanted to believe her. She gave them a story that made them feel good, that made them feel as though they were part of something noble simply by supporting her, and I knew that tearing away that story would feel to them like losing a piece of themselves. The lawyers moved through their arguments with practiced rhythm, one side painting her as a selfless figure wronged by an ungrateful family, the other side, our side, setting the foundation for the truth with methodical precision. I kept my eyes on the judge, watching the way his gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, from the papers in front of him to the faces of the people speaking. My mother sat beside me with her hands folded, the picture of composure, but I could sense the restrained energy beneath her calm, the way a still lake can hide the strongest current. We both knew that the evidence we carried could end this charade, but we also understood that timing mattered as much as facts in a room like this. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the woman's influence had spread even further, as if she sensed the walls closing in and decided to push outward before they could meet. She had appeared in more photographs, accepted more public praise, and even managed to attach her name to a charitable fund meant for veterans, ensuring that anyone who doubted her would seem as though they were doubting the cause itself. It was a clever move, one that made our work more difficult because it wrapped her in a shield of goodwill that most people would hesitate to pierce. My mother and I had worked quietly, meeting with the lawyer in the late hours when the streets were empty, reviewing each document and photograph until the paper edges curled from handling, making sure nothing was missing, nothing could be questioned. The box from my uncle had become the heart of our case. Inside, the letters told a story so ordinary it could only be real: names of bases, dates of training, mentions of weather, meals, and fellow service members that matched official rosters exactly. Her name, The name she had so boldly tied to our family appeared nowhere. The photographs showed the real owners of those uniforms and medals, people my mother recognized from years past, faces worn by time and service in ways no perfectly tailored jacket could replicate. These details were more than proof. They were the living pulse of truth, and each one stood in quiet opposition to the polished fiction she had built. But truth, I had learned, was rarely welcomed with open arms. In the days before the hearing, there had been subtle signs that someone wanted us to fail. A misplaced envelope at the lawyer's office, a stranger lingering too long near my mother's car, and a phone call in the night that left only silence on the other end. None of it was direct enough to accuse, but all of it left the faint taste of warning. We had taken precautions, locking duplicates of the evidence in separate places, sharing copies with trusted hands, making sure that even if one path was cut, another would remain open. My mother's voice had been steady through it all, reminding me that we were not fighting for applause or revenge, but for the integrity of something our family had carried for generations. Now, in this room, I could see how tightly the woman held to her performance. Her eyes moved to the judge with practiced sincerity, her hands resting lightly on the table, as if to signal calm control, her every movement calculated to inspire sympathy. The people in the gallery leaned forward when she spoke, their faces softening in the shared warmth of her story. I wondered if they would look the same once they saw the truth, if they would turn away in embarrassment or double down on their belief to avoid admitting they had been wrong. People often choose the comfort of the familiar lie over the discomfort of a new reality, no matter how solid the evidence. As the hours passed, I could feel the moment approaching, that shift in the air when preparation meets opportunity. My mother remained still, but her presence felt larger somehow, as though she was waiting for a signal only she could hear. The judge's expression never wavered, but his eyes told a story of their own, a quiet acknowledgement that something significant was about to enter the record. I knew that when my mother moved, it would not be for show. It would be with the certainty of a person who has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. The room seemed to tighten as the arguments reached their peak, the air thick with unspoken expectations. I could almost hear the hum of the tension, feel the collective breath of a crowd waiting for a conclusion that would either validate their admiration or tear it apart. My hand brushed against the wooden edge of my uncle's box, and I thought about the years it had been hidden, about the care it had taken to preserve those letters and photographs, about the quiet foresight it had taken to leave them for me. It felt like a relay, as though my uncle had passed me the truth and trusted me not to drop it, no matter how rough the path became. By the time the judge called for a recess, I knew we were only steps away from the moment that would decide everything. My mother rose slowly, not in defiance, but in deliberate readiness, and as she straightened her jacket, I could see the resolve in her posture. Whatever came next, it would leave the room changed. And in that stillness, with the eyes of the room on us, I understood that the story we were about to tell was not just for us. It was for every quiet truth that had ever been overshadowed by a beautiful lie. In the days that followed that first hearing, I began to understand just how intricate her web had been, and how deliberately each thread had been placed not simply to tell a story, but to protect it from ever being questioned, as though she had built her life like a house with walls of glass, beautiful to look at, yet positioned so that anyone approaching from the wrong angle would be blinded by the reflection rather than see what was inside. Every detail of her supposed service had been borrowed from somewhere, pieces taken from the lives of real people, some living, some gone, their experiences cut and reshaped until they fit the image she wanted the world to see. And the most chilling part was how effortlessly she had woven our family into that image, as though she had rehearsed the role of belonging long before she ever stepped into our town. I spent hours going over the letters from my uncle's box, reading them until the handwriting felt familiar, until I could hear his voice in the small details about the weather on a certain day, or the way the light hit the barracks in the early morning, or the long waits between orders that made time stretch in unnatural ways. My mother would sit across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes on the documents, tracing dates and names against her own memories of deployments and colleagues, cross-checking the tiniest scraps of information with records only she knew how to find. Piece by piece, the truth sharpened into focus, each connection pulling us closer to the point where her story would unravel completely. But with each step forward came a sense that she was watching us, not openly, but through the sudden appearance of small obstacles that felt too precise to be coincidence. A request for records would be delayed without explanation. A file we had seen one day would be marked as unavailable the next. And once, late in the evening, I noticed a car idling a little too long near the end of my driveway, its headlights off, as though the driver was waiting to see if I would come outside. None of it could be proven, yet all of it whispered the same warning, that she knew her image was at risk and that she would not let it shatter without resistance. The deeper we went, the more I saw how she had used the hunger of others to build her shield. She had aligned herself with local causes, appeared in photographs with respected figures, donated just enough to charities to have her name appear on programs and plaques. It was a strategy that made questioning her feel like questioning the goodness she seemed to represent, and for many in the town, that was unthinkable. Even the press, which should have been impartial, carried her story with an almost protective tone, the photographs always catching her in soft light, the captions framing her as a figure of inspiration rather than scrutiny. It would have been easy to feel overwhelmed, to believe that the truth was too small to fight against the momentum of a well-crafted lie, but my mother never wavered. She approached each day as though it were a mission, with tasks to be completed, evidence to be secured, and preparations to be made. She reminded me that the truth has its own kind of endurance, that while lies can run fast, they tire quickly when the terrain turns rough, and that our job was not to match her pace, but to keep moving steadily forward. Then, one afternoon, while sorting through a stack of photographs that had been stored in the attic for decades, I found an image that seemed ordinary at first. A group of service members standing in front of a transport vehicle, the edges of the picture faded and curling with age. But when I looked closer, I saw that one of the uniforms bore the exact set of ribbons the woman had been wearing at the fundraiser, arranged in the same order. The man in the photograph was not her, not even close, and I realized that she had not just copied the uniform style. She had replicated it entirely, down to the smallest detail, as if lifting it directly from someone else's life. We brought the photograph to our lawyer, pairing it with the official records that confirmed the man's identity and service history. It was the kind of evidence that could not be argued away as misunderstanding or coincidence. It was direct, concrete, and damning. Yet even as we secured it in a safe location, I felt the tension tighten, because evidence alone does not guarantee justice. It still had to be presented, believed, and acted upon in a room where sympathy can sometimes outweigh fact. As the next hearing approached, the town seemed to buzz with anticipation, not because they knew the truth, but because they sensed that something was coming. People whispered in store aisles, paused in conversations when I passed, and I could feel the invisible line dividing those who quietly supported us from those who still clung to the image she had given them. My mother, as always, remained outwardly composed, yet I could see the resolve in the way she prepared her papers, the way she selected her clothing, the way she carried herself as if each step was part of a path she had already walked in her mind. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept thinking of my uncle, of the trust he had placed in me by leaving that box, of the years it had waited in the shadows for this moment. I thought of my mother's quiet strength, the kind that does not seek attention, yet commands respect. And I thought of the woman across the aisle, wondering if she lay awake as well, sensing that the fabric she had wrapped herself in was about to come undone in front of everyone she had ever impressed. When the morning came, the air felt heavier than before, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. We walked into the courthouse side by side, my mother's steps measured, mine quickened by the surge of adrenaline I couldn't quite control. The gallery was already full, faces turned toward us, some curious, some cold, all waiting for the moment when the two sides would clash, not just in words, but in proof. We took our seats, and I placed the photograph, along with the rest of our evidence, on the table in front of us, feeling the solid weight of it under my hand. Across the room, she adjusted her robe, her eyes meeting mine for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief connection, I saw something I hadn't before. Not defiance, not confidence, but the flicker of recognition that her performance was nearing its final act. And as the judge entered, the sound of the gavel sharp and final, I knew we were stepping into the moment we had been building toward for months, the moment when truth and deception would stand side by side, waiting to see which one the room would choose to believe. The second hearing began under a sky so pale it seemed almost fragile, as though even the weather understood that the day ahead was one where a single shift could change everything. And as we took our places in the courtroom, the air felt heavier, thicker, like it was holding its breath along with everyone else who had come to watch, each face turned toward us with the kind of anticipation that is part curiosity and part hunger for spectacle. The judge's voice was steady as the proceedings began. Yet beneath that calm formality, there was an unspoken tension in the room, a sense that whatever unfolded here would ripple far beyond these walls, touching reputations, friendships, and the unsteady balance of trust in a community that had been living inside a carefully constructed story for far too long. Our lawyer began presenting the evidence in a sequence we had carefully planned, each piece laid down like stepping stones across a fast-moving river. The photographs, letters, and official records began to chip away at the immaculate image she had cultivated, yet she sat across the aisle with her hands folded neatly, her expression controlled, her gaze sweeping the room as if taking mental note of who still looked at her with belief and who had started to turn away. My mother remained still beside me, her hands resting on the table, but I could feel the pulse of energy in her presence, the way she was holding herself ready for the moment we had discussed so many times in the quiet of our kitchen, the moment when the truth would no longer be kept in folders, but would stand on its own in the full light of the room. Then, just as our lawyer reached for the wooden box to remove the photograph that would connect every thread in our case, something happened that nearly stopped my breath. The courtroom doors opened abruptly, and a man in a dark suit strode in, holding a folder thick with papers, his face unreadable as he handed it to the bailiff, who in turn brought it directly to the judge. The entire room seemed to lean toward the bench without moving, the collective curiosity sharp enough to cut, and as the judge read through the contents, a shadow crossed his face so subtly that most people would have missed it, but I saw it, and my stomach clenched, because in that moment I imagined the worst, that somehow she had produced her own stack of documents, forged well enough to muddy the waters, timed perfectly to cast doubt just when our case was strongest. The judge looked up, his gaze sweeping across both tables, and for one long, unbearable moment, the air between us all felt like a taut wire ready to snap. But then, with the smallest flicker of his hand, he set the folder aside and spoke quietly to the clerk, who nodded and removed it from the table, placing it among other items to be reviewed later, and I felt my chest loosen just enough to draw a steady breath again, realizing that whatever had been in those papers had not been enough to derail the moment we had worked toward for months, and that for now, the ground beneath us was still solid. I glanced at my mother, who had not moved, her calm unbroken, though I knew she had felt the same flash of tension, and I understood again why her steadiness was the anchor that kept me from being swept away by every sudden shift. The presentation continued, the photograph brought forward, the records displayed, each page a quiet but undeniable contradiction to her claims, and while she did not flinch, I saw the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers tapped once against her knee before she stilled them. Small signs that her composure was no longer effortless, but carefully maintained. The gallery was silent now, no murmurs, no shifting in seats, only the sound of paper moving and the occasional creak of wood as someone adjusted their weight, all eyes fixed on the slow dismantling of the story they had once been so eager to believe. As the final piece of evidence was placed before the judge, there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. the kind of quiet that comes not from absence of noise, but from the collective understanding that something significant has just happened. And I realized we were standing on the edge of the moment my mother had been waiting for, the one where she would rise and let the truth speak not from documents, but from the undeniable presence of someone who had lived the life the other woman had only borrowed. The judge called for a brief recess, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a deeper awareness of what was about to come. And as we stood, I felt that same shift in the air I had sensed before, the subtle change that signals a turning point from which there is no return. We stepped into the hallway, my mother walking beside me with the same measured pace she had carried all morning, and though my heart was still beating harder than I would admit, I felt the certainty settle back into place. Whatever attempts had been made to shake us had failed, and the truth was still in our hands, intact, waiting for the moment when it would no longer need our protection. When the judge returned from the recess, the air in the courtroom felt sharper, as though every molecule carried a charge, and as people settled back into their seats, the room seemed to close in around us. The space smaller, the silence heavier, the anticipation almost tangible, and I could sense in the posture of those around me that they understood, even if they could not yet name it, that the balance of this case was about to tilt in a way none of them would forget. Our lawyer remained seated, the evidence already placed in careful order on the table, each piece aligned like stones marking the path we had followed. But I barely saw them now, because my focus had narrowed to my mother beside me, her presence steady, her shoulders squared, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood as if she had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. The judge began speaking, his tone measured, recapping the points raised, the documents submitted, the photographs displayed, and as he did, I could feel the woman across the aisle watching him intently, still holding her expression in that careful shape of quiet dignity, still trusting in the strength of the image she had built, perhaps believing that the years she had spent weaving it could not be undone in an hour. But then, my mother moved, not abruptly, not with the drama of someone seeking attention, but with the deliberate grace of a person who knows that every gesture carries weight, and in that still room even the smallest shift drew every gaze toward her. She stood slowly, her chair sliding back in near silence, and for a moment she simply remained there, upright, letting the stillness gather around her until the sound of it seemed to hum in my ears. Then her hands rose to the front of her robe, not the heavy judicial kind, but the plain formal covering she had chosen to wear for this day, and with a motion so calm it seemed almost ceremonial, she parted it and slipped it from her shoulders, revealing beneath it not the ordinary clothing anyone might expect, but the preserved uniform of her own service, the fabric worn in ways that spoke of real years and real work, the metals dulled slightly by time, but gleaming in the light that fell across the room. It was not loud, it was not theatrical, and yet it was the loudest thing I had ever witnessed without a single word being spoken. The gallery stilled, the shuffling and murmurs that had always been there before were gone, replaced by a collective pause so deep it felt as though even the walls were listening. My mother stood there as the embodiment of the life the other woman had borrowed, the truth made visible in a way that could not be argued, and I saw the shift in the woman's eyes, the exact moment when she recognized that her story could not stand against the living proof before her. The judge's expression did not change much, but there was a certain gravity in the way he regarded my mother now, his gaze moving from her to the woman across the aisle and back again, as if to measure the distance between truth and imitation in a way only he could truly weigh. The lawyer for the other side began to stir, as though ready to object, but even he seemed to falter, his hands hesitating over his papers, as if realizing that no amount of argument could erase the difference now on display. My mother did not speak, did not raise her voice or point a finger. She simply remained standing, her uniform carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned every thread, every ribbon, every crease. And as the weight of that reality settled over the room, I understood that this was the moment the fight had been leading to all along. Not the signing of papers or the reading of verdicts, but the instant when truth stood up and refused to sit down again. When she finally took her seat, the silence lingered for a heartbeat longer before the judge continued, his tone unchanged, but the direction of the case now unmistakable. The woman across the aisle lowered her gaze to her folded hands, and I knew in that small movement that she had felt the walls of her story shift, the carefully built structure groaning under the weight of proof it could no longer bear. For me, it was not triumph in the usual sense. It was the deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth we had carried so carefully had found its way into the light, and that it had done so with dignity intact. The days after my mother's quiet but devastating reveal moved like the slow turn of a tide, deliberate and unstoppable, and when the judge finally called us back for the final hearing, the room felt different, as if everyone inside knew they were about to witness the conclusion of something that had already shifted beneath their feet. The woman across the aisle no longer wore the easy confidence she had carried for months. Instead, her posture was rigid, her eyes moving quickly from face to face, as though searching for someone still willing to look at her the way they once had. But even in the scattered smiles she managed to draw, there was hesitation now, a crack in the seamless approval she had relied on. The judge began by acknowledging the evidence, his words calm but weighted, detailing the chain of proof that left no space for doubt. The verified records, the photographs, the letters that told a story too ordinary to be anything but true. The uniform worn by my mother, with the quiet authority of someone who had lived its history rather than borrowed it. His decision was clear. The claims she had made to our name, to our history, and to the funds she sought were without merit, and she was ordered to repay every cent she had taken under the guise of her false identity. The room shifted, a ripple of surprise running through those who had still clung to her story. And for a moment I thought that would be the end of it, the clean conclusion we had worked for. But then, just as the gavel was about to fall, the court clerk stepped forward with a document that had arrived only minutes earlier, marked urgent, and handed it to the judge. He read it in silence, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly, and when he looked up, I felt the air change, the same way it had in that moment weeks ago, when a folder had been handed to him mid-hearing. Only this time it was not a threat to our case, but something entirely different. The document, sent by a federal archive office, contained confirmation that the woman had not only fabricated her service record, but had also used our family's name to secure grants and contracts intended for veterans projects, channeling the funds through accounts she controlled. This was no longer a matter of false claims and reputation. It was fraud on a scale that would bring consequences far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The judge's ruling expanded instantly, his tone firm now, no longer simply addressing a civil dispute, but ordering that the matter be referred for criminal investigation. And in that moment, I saw the second wave of realization crash over her, the understanding that not only had she lost the image she had so carefully built, but she had also stepped into a storm that would strip away the very foundation she had lived on. The gallery was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in, and for the first time she seemed smaller, her shoulders rounding as though the air itself had turned heavy against her. In the weeks that followed, the news spread quickly. The grants she had stolen were traced, the accounts frozen, and the organizations she had misled were informed. She faced charges that would keep her out of the community she had once commanded with charm and stories, and though some still tried to defend her, the tide had turned too far to be pushed back. The funds recovered from her accounts were returned, and at my mother's request, they were directed toward scholarships for children of real veterans, a decision that brought a quiet sense of closure to the fight we had waged. And yet, just when I thought the final page had been turned, another letter arrived, not from a court or an agency, but from a woman living 2 states away, who had recognized the face from a newspaper photo and wrote to tell us that she had known her under a different name years ago, when she had embedded herself into another family's life with a different fabricated history, leaving just before questions began to surface. The letter included photographs, copies of old documents, and a timeline so eerily similar to ours that it was as if she had been running the same play in different towns for decades. It was then that I understood this was more than just our story. It was a pattern she had lived in, one that had finally reached the end of its run. Authorities reached out to the woman who had written to us, connecting her account to ours, and with the combined evidence from multiple victims, the case against her grew unshakable. When the final verdict came months later, it was not just restitution and repayment. It was a permanent record that would follow her, ensuring she could never again step into another community wearing someone else's name and someone else's honor. Standing outside the courthouse on that last day, the air crisp and bright, I looked at my mother and felt the deep, steady pride of knowing that we had carried the truth all the way to its rightful place, that the people who had once doubted us now understood, and that every person who needed to be held accountable had been. My mother's eyes softened as she looked at the small crowd that had gathered, many of them offering quiet words of respect, and I felt that the weight we had carried for so long had finally lifted. And to those listening now, I will say this. Have you ever watched a lie unravel so completely that it left nothing standing in its place? And if it happened in your life, would you have the patience to carry the truth all the way to the end, no matter how many storms it had to survive?